So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the second session of today's meeting. And we have three speakers, but Nikita will be actually presenting two papers, 15 minutes each. Then Avik Sarkar, and then followed by Harsha Krishna. And we will have discussions following their presentations, and after each week we'll continue discussions. So you feel free to ask questions, but I would request you to ask those questions later during the discussions so that we can stick to the time schedule. Okay? So, Nikita.
So while everyone is coming, I'll just give an introduction to myself. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very, very pleased to be here with all of you. I'm Nikita, and I'm working with the Center for Land Warfare Studies. This is a think tank of the Indian Army where we focus on national security, global security issues, weapon system analysis, and the like. I particularly focus on terrorism research as well as on certain weapon system analysis. And I will be talking to you about certain aspects of that subject. Before joining CLAWS, as we call it, I was working with the Indian mission to the United Nations in Geneva, where I was focused on representing India at the Human Rights Council, specifically to the countries of South and Latin America, as well as of the Middle East. So my presentations today will be with both of these subjects. My first presentation, which as you can see on the screen, is on forecasting the decisions taken by states to initiate as well as to end interstate wars. This will focus specifically on situations where you cannot assume the rationality of players or the state people that we have, the presidents or the prime ministers. And here I will be using game theory and whether it can help us forecast the decisions as they are taken, even in such situations. My second presentation today will be on suicide terrorism. In this, I'll be focusing again using game theory to understand how the terrorists choose the different locations where to attack, how to attack, which population sectors to attack, and how do they go about doing it. So this is the only part of suicide terrorism I'll be addressing today. Of course, if you want to ask about other things and the change in pattern technology as well as the new changes in IED, like the 3-star and the 4-5 rounds things, I'll be happy to discuss that. But I look forward to doing that. So I'll be starting first with my first presentation, which is on the threat and use of force, forecasting the decision to initiate interstate wars in times of uncertainty. So if you take up any newspaper today or any foreign policy journal, the first thing that comes out at you is the threat of war is there. We are going to have World War III. US is going to start a war on Iran. The different wars are going to start. India is again fighting with Pakistan. And these are the levels of trust which are decreasing. Against this backdrop, when we have all of these rising tensions among the world leaders, I think that's a good time for us to talk about whether we will be having such wars or not be having such wars and how they will play out. So foreign policy decision making, in a sense, is about problem solving. It's about getting to situation Y, how do we get to policy X? So it's of course made like, okay, we want to have such and such kind of standing internationally, but the ideal situations are never there in real world. So how do we get about those, in those not so ideal situations, the policy that we want? In times of crisis and uncertainty, the implicit rationality and the normalcy of decision making gets further reduced. And we cannot assume that they are rational. What if your leaders are, say, just stupid, or they are under a lot of stress, or they have been drinking, or they have been taking drugs? All of these things do happen. So how do you assume and how do you forecast in those scenarios? This would be the central puzzle for us, that in order to forecast and predict foreign policy decisions of a state to initiate an interstate war, we need to assume some level of rationality and consistency in the decision-making process that is undertaken by those in the decision-making positions, and that they have certain end goals and values that they hold dear to them, that they be wanting to fight for. However, these goals and values of a country and its leaders are not clear. always at least, the decisions taken by them are heavily dependent on perceptions, ideologies, backgrounds, which do not always lead to a rational understanding of policy decision by states. So when you're talking about this, the main question is that how do states really decide to enter into war? If tomorrow Trump is supposed to attack Iran, or when he backs out at 2 minutes prior to the attack, how is that decision being taken? And because it's an expensive exercise, how do they choose the use of force over the threat of use of force when they are considered to be equally effective, at least theoretically? That if I say that I'm going to slap you, you better do it the way you always scold your children, they quite often do it, right? You don't always have to slap them, so how do you choose when to do what? Apart from that, I'll be looking at secondary questions, again focus on the international scenario. How do political leaders understand the different situations to be crisis situations? And how do they communicate their ideas with each other? And how does crisis communication work, apart from hotlines, of course? And what is exactly going on in their heads? So specifically, I'm considering a scenario where a state is faced with a foreign policy crisis, such as a military threat from another state, or the possibility of a strong military action by another state, and has to decide whether a simple threat of retaliation would suffice, or whether it needs to initiate an interstate war. So in moving away from assumptions of rationality of foreign policy decision making, and I'll be looking at it from a different angle. My main argument here is that crisis is going to be defined by leaders when there's a significant diversion from international norms of behavior. This becomes important for one main reason, that there are certain issues which are going to be always considered normal. For instance, seeing that Iran is going to move away from its commitments can be seen as something that was normal. The US somewhere predicted that. Most of the P5+1 countries all predicted that. So that was not a crisis situation. But the crisis situation became when a country was ready to strike at another country before announcing it. That goes against international norms. So the secondary personality traits are epiphenomenal correlates. This means that personality will play a big role in the making of decisions, but it's not going to be the central factor. While we often talk about decisions being taken by single actors, say Merkel, Trump, Modi, Imran Khan, or whatever, they are not acting alone. They have a whole bunch of advisors and people who are backing them, who are making the decisions. They have consulates, they have military advisors. So what we have in India, for example, is the CCS, the Committee on Security, the Central Committee on Security. That involves a lot of people. So we're not going to say that personality traits become important. So that brings in a kind of predictability into the system. Finally, the foreign policy decision-making with regard to initiation of interstate wars is influenced by availability heuristics. This is different from generally available heuristics because these are the rules of thumbs, as you know, heuristics like, okay, this is a bad decision or it can lead to the next Kargil war. That if I say in this audience, it will make a lot more sense than saying it will lead to the next Munich, because we were not involved that directly with the Munich Agreement as it was signed in the Second World War. But Kargil War affected us more directly. So the decisions as they are taken by the state leaders will be based on the way that they're using the heuristics that are available with them to change a decision in one favor or another. So I'll be using a lot of theory based on these few areas. First, of course, I'm quite sure you're all aware of the optimizing versus satisficing debate that we have. Moving away from that, I'll be looking at some aspects of the prospect theory. Prospect theory even goes beyond satisficing, where we're talking about the different ways that that it's about the availability heuristics and how it plays into the debates. Again, after that, I'll be looking at analogies, cases, precedents. The most important part is prestige, power, inventions, and how they play into the game. So coming to the game, this I'll be taking to be a standoff between two players or states, where the incentives for playing the game are adequate. Players have played the game before, but not with each other. That's the main important point, that at least the state leaders or the people in the committees would be different. So there will be some level of unpredictability. This is just in order to make sure that it's not becoming a super game. And finally, the threats of war and the repercussions have to be credible. So these are some of the other assumptions that I'm taking, that the policy makers are integrated into the international platform. This becomes important because I will be talking about the international prestige cost. How do states react when they know the other states in the international forum are going to support them or be totally against them? How will that change their behavior? Secondly, they have a power system within each other. That is, they're not always equal. So here will be a major diversion from the other established rules of the game, where we're always taking two players to be almost equal. Because say, the current situation of Iran and the US, they're not equal in any aspect. Also, even India and Pakistan, when we were having the recent crisis, post-Pulwama, it was not an equal game. So I'll be taking those scenarios where these situations are actually being affected, and you can read through the rest. So finally, I just want to talk about this, that threats and use of force are considered usually to be anti each other. That you either use the threat of force or the use of force, but they together work hand in hand to explain the way crisis situations develop inside a CCS or any committee which is looking at the security during a foreign policy crisis. And this non-linear fashion of progression is because in any conflict situation, there's power, right? So this escalation of party A over party B in any manner gives it a relative advantage in terms of power asymmetry. So with this, this is the situation as I've explained to you, that state 1 will threaten state 2 by taking any particular action, and then threats have been made. It will be sequential, and these are the parameters that I'll be looking at. This is the game, as you can see before you. So in moving away from other areas where we have, I don't think it's coming that clearly, I'm so sorry for that, but we always have thought that if you're threatened, you can either retaliate or not retaliate. But actually, we have something that's called flexible response, and within that, I'll be taking at 5 actual response options that are available. One is, of course, ignoring the threat in balance or the change in balance. Second, from the other extreme, is appeasement. And then we have politically negotiated agreements, containment, and to retaliate. So I know that some of these terms are more political science terms, so if you have an issue, just you can ask in between, all right? So as I was saying, appeasement and ignoring any threat that is coming your way are actually non-options. These are just options that we're just writing because, well, yeah, we can think of it like that. But in a sense, we have 3 options, which is politically negotiated agreements, containment, and retaliation. Within that, of course, a state can accept it, it can use force, or it can escalate the threat even further, which can then lead to a retaliation with force or an acceptation of the escalated demand. So with this, I am using an made the diagram. So, but how do we translate these models from theory into diplomacy? So when I was working with the Indian mission to the UN, one thing that was quite obvious is that we're not actually only talking directly in the counselor sessions. We were actually talking over cups of tea and coffee, or we were standing outside and smoking and talking to each other to support each other. Because those international platforms actually become quite important to get other states to embrace it. And you have a particular belief systems, and how do you assess that? Based on that, I've developed certain general observations where P delta Ti is the international prestige cost, which is going to have to discount simultaneously by the time. So if you're taking a long time to respond to an international threat, it's going to keep decreasing, but I'm keeping that as a constant at any point of time. And at any point, then this is the way it can be played out, depending on the power symmetry or asymmetry between the 2 players. So if the utility of winning is more than the domestic audience cost minus the military cost, that is, we are going to win better and we're going to have less cost, including the audience cost is going to be favorable to us, we're going to use force. That's the only time when we're really going to start using, and we're going to engage militarily. Second, if the winning of war is slightly more than 0, which is still less than the audience cost and the military cost, you will use the threat of use of force. You will not actually start a war, because then your military cost as well as the domestic audience cost of how your people behave will change. The A part is the only part which I'm focusing on because, well, politicians are basically focused on winning the next election. So that's why that is so important. Secondly, if the audience cost is greater than the military cost, such that it's more than half of your cost, then you will use force. That your people are supporting the use of war or the use of force, then yes, you will go, even if it incurs a lot of expenditure and military expenditure, and you can't afford that. Fine. Second last point is that if the military cost is slightly more than the domestic audience cost, that is, the cost to go to war is turning out to be a bit more expensive than actually the support that you're gaining from your population, which is still going to be more than 0, you will be a bit more calculated, and you will use the threat of the use of force that, yes, we will retaliate after some time, you better regress. And finally, if the audience cost is way more than military cost and both of that is more than 0, then we will have use of force. So while it may not be, this is the line which I spoke last time, that it's not enough to just say that this is a game that can explain everything and how things are really taking place. You always have to see the different scenario in which you are. The power imbalance between the different states will account for the biggest difference. If you are fighting against a major power and it's a small power, then of course your threat will increase more and you will more likely to engage in use of force. However, on the other side, if you are being threatened by a smaller state, which almost has no backing, then again, you will not, you might just ignore it or make a threat of force. But if suppose it's China who's threatening Taiwan, and Taiwan has the backing of the US, then of course things will change. So the power dynamics is actually something that can be used and applied in this model. And so cost-benefit analysis in these situations then becomes related to affect and not just a pure cost-based analysis. And decision-making in crisis is never rational. We are going to use heuristics, as I've shared in the paper already. And finally, it's going to be about international norms. So I know, well, some people have already talked about the norms which are being used. We are using social norms, meta-norms and hyper-norms. Meta-norms are basically the norms of punishment that if you do not agree or adhere to the rules of the game, then you're going to be punished. And hyper-norms is when you're using things like gender. For example, if you're saying that, okay, if you're not retaliating against a threat of war from another country, then you're being effeminate, then yeah, that is going to increase the level of force that is going to be used. And that we have seen even at the micro level to right up to the macro level. So finally, in conclusion, actors will act in accordance with certain international norms and power positions. And decisions in terms of uncertainty will be based on affect, which is basically the personality, the upbringing, the beliefs and perceptions, which is going to change the way the different heuristics are being used by the state leaders. And finally, the state and its political leaders' image in the international sphere will accentuate the time in which such decisions may be taken. So I just have some bibliography, I'll cancel that.